The snow had fallen in thick, muffling layers, wrapping the entire village in an eerie silence. The only sound that broke the stillness was the distant toll of bells. Soft at first, they seemed to float on the icy wind, growing louder with each chime. I never liked the sound of those bells. They rang every Christmas Eve exactly at midnight, but no one ever claimed to know who rang them, and no one dared to find out. My grandmother used to call them warning bells. "Stay inside when they toll," she'd say, her voice trembling. "Never look for the source. Some things are best left unseen." I didn't believe her until last year. I was 15 then, full of curiosity and convinced the village was just caught up in old superstitions. So when the bells rang out that night, I ignored her warning. I wrapped myself in my thickest coat, slipped on my boots, and stepped into the freezing darkness. The air felt heavier outside, like the cold had a grip on my lungs. Every step crunched loudly beneath my feet, but the bells, they were clearer now, almost beckoning me forward. I should have turned back, but something about the sound felt almost hypnotic, drawing me deeper into the night. The bells led me to the edge of the village, where the old church stood, its steeple looming like a dark sentinel against the night sky. The doors, swollen with age and frost, were slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed against them. Inside, the pews were covered in a thin layer of dust, as if no one had sat there for years. Yet the air was thick with the smell of candle wax and something else, something metallic. I hesitated, my breath visible in the freezing air, then stepped inside. That's when I saw the footprints, tiny, scattered prints in the dust, leading from the door to the altar. They couldn't have been more than a few hours old. My heart pounded. No one was supposed to be here. I followed them slowly, each step echoing in the empty space. As I neared the altar, I spotted something that made my stomach twist, a small red mitten crumpled on the cold stone. It belonged to Tommy, the boy who had vanished last Christmas Eve, the one we all thought had wandered too far into the woods and succumbed to the cold. But what was it doing here a year later? Then I heard it, a faint whisper just beyond the altar. I froze, straining to listen. It wasn't words, not exactly. Just a soft, raspy sound, like a voice trying to break through layers of ice. I stepped closer, and the whisper turned into a low, chilling laugh. The laugh lingered in the air, sending chills down my spine. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, stepping cautiously around the altar. The whispering laugh faded, replaced by an unnatural silence that seemed to press against my ears. Then I saw it. At the far corner of the church, just beyond the reach of the flickering candlelight, a shadow moved. It wasn't cast by anything I could see, no person, no object. It writhed on its own, shifting and stretching like it was alive. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, though my throat was tight with fear. The shadow stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, it began to grow, spreading across the floor and climbing the walls like ink spilled on paper. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet refused to move. The bells outside tolled again, louder this time, almost deafening. The shadow pulsed with each chime, and I could feel it watching me, and then from its depths a shape began to emerge. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs distorted as if stretched too far. Its face, or what I thought was a face, was pale and featureless, except for two hollow eyes that seemed to suck in the light. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice a low, guttural rasp. My mind screamed, but my body was frozen. The figure took a step toward me, and I felt the cold intensify, biting through my coat and into my bones. The last thing I saw before everything went black was its hand, long and skeletal, reaching for me. Christmas morning always came with an air of excitement in our house. Wrapping paper flying, laughter echoing, and the smell of cinnamon wafting from the kitchen. But that year, one package didn't belong. It wasn't wrapped in the bright reds and greens like the others. Instead, it was dull, wrapped in plain brown paper with no name or tag. It sat at the very back of the tree, as if trying to hide. "Who's this from?" I asked, holding it up. My parents exchanged puzzled glances. "No idea," my mom said. "Maybe someone dropped it off last night." I shrugged, thinking it was just a forgotten gift. Curiosity got the better of me, so I tore into the paper. Inside was a small wooden box, smooth but unremarkable, except for a strange, burnt smell that clung to it. "Looks old," my dad said, leaning in for a closer look. I opened the box, expecting jewelry or maybe a trinket. Instead, there was just a slip of paper, yellowed with age, and a single word scrawled in red ink. "Listen, what kind of joke is this?" I muttered, but no one laughed. My dad took the box, turning it over in his hands. The room grew quieter, as if the air itself had thickened. Then we heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It seemed to come from inside the box. The tapping grew louder as we stared at the box. My dad shook it, but it didn't stop. The sound was steady, like a heartbeat. "Probably just a prank toy," he said, though his voice wavered. He placed the box on the table, but none of us could look away. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence was worse. My mom glanced at the clock. "Let's finish opening presents," she said, trying to lighten the mood. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Later that night, I lay in bed, the box still on my desk. I didn't want it near me, but throwing it away felt wrong, like it wouldn't let me. As the house settled into its usual nighttime quiet, I began to drift off. Tap, tap, tap. I sat bolt upright. The box was closed, but the tapping was back, louder. With trembling hands, I opened it. The slip of paper was gone. Instead, there was a small blackened object inside, something that hadn't been there before, a jagged piece of bone. The tapping stopped again, but this time it was replaced by a low whisper. "Do you hear it?" I froze. The voice wasn't coming from the box. It was coming from the dark corner of my room. My breath caught in my throat as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. I wanted to look toward the corner, but fear rooted me in place. "Do you hear it?" The voice repeated, its tone sharper now, cutting through the cold stillness of the room. Slowly, I turned my head. At first, I saw nothing but shadows, thick and unmoving. But then something shifted. A figure, hunched and barely visible, seemed to emerge from the darkness. It moved unnaturally, jerking closer with each breath I took. The box on my desk began to rattle violently. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, and the whisper turned into a piercing scream. "Open it." I didn't want to, but my hands moved on their own, drawn by some invisible force. I reached for the box, its surface now burning hot. As I lifted the lid, the jagged bone inside began to pulse, glowing faintly. The figure in the corner surged forward, its face, or what was left of it, twisted in a grotesque grin. "You've accepted the gift," it rasped, its voice a mix of malice and triumph. Suddenly, the box shattered in my hands, and everything went black. When I woke up, the room was empty, the box, the bone, the figure all gone, but the whispers never left. Every night since, they return, calling me, reminding me that I've become a part of the curse. And every Christmas, a new gift appears under our tree. It started with a knock, late on Christmas Eve, just as the snowstorm outside had reached its peak. Someone knocked at our door. 3 soft raps, followed by silence. My parents were already asleep, and our house stood at the edge of town, far from any neighbors. No one should have been out there in that weather. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, through the wooden frame, I heard it, a song. It was low, almost a hum, but the melody was off, like a Christmas carol sung by someone who had forgotten the words. Slowly, I opened the door, and there they were. 3 figures, faces hidden beneath heavy hoods, stood motionless on our porch. Their clothes were old, frayed, and covered in frost, but it was their singing that sent a chill through me. It wasn't joyful or comforting. It was cold, hollow, and somehow wrong. They didn't move. They didn't stop singing. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaky. The singing paused. One of them stepped forward, lowering their hood. Beneath it was a pale, hollow face, eyes sunken deep into their sockets. The lips curled into a chilling smile as they spoke. "We've come to sing for you." The figure's smile didn't reach their eyes, which remained dark and empty, fixed on me. The other 2 carolers stood motionless, their faces still hidden beneath their hoods. Before I could say anything, the singing resumed. This time the melody was louder, sharper, and it echoed unnaturally in the freezing air. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding, but the song didn't stop. It seeped through the walls, curling around me like a cold, invisible fog. I stumbled back into the living room, where the soft glow of the Christmas tree felt suddenly dimmer, as if the light itself was retreating. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the screen was blank, completely dead. A quick glance at the clock on the wall confirmed my fear. The second hand wasn't moving. Time itself seemed to have stopped. Then came the knocking again. 3 raps, deliberate and slow. This time it wasn't just from the front door. The sound echoed from every window, as if the entire house was surrounded. And through it all, the singing continued, growing louder, more twisted. It was no longer a melody, it was a chant, a cold and haunting dirge. A voice whispered in my ear, though no one was there, "Let us in." The whispers grew louder, circling me like a swarm of icy breaths. Every window rattled as the knocking intensified, each rap in perfect rhythm with the twisted chant outside. I stumbled toward the fireplace, grabbing the iron poker, my hands trembling. "Leave," I shouted, my voice cracking. "You're not welcome here." The singing stopped. For a moment, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, slowly, the front door creaked open, even though I'd locked it. The air turned bitterly cold, and the lights on the Christmas tree flickered and died. They were inside. The 3 figures stood in the doorway, their hollow eyes glowing. Faintly in the dark, the leader stepped forward, their smile stretching unnaturally wide. "You didn't invite us," they said, their voice a blend of many, each word dripping with malice. "But we're here now." I swung the poker, but it passed through them like smoke. They advanced, their song starting again, now a cacophony of discordant notes that made my head throb. I collapsed to the floor, my vision blurring as the world seemed to twist and spin around me. The last thing I saw was the leader leaning in close, their icy breath on my face. "This song is your gift and your curse." When I woke, it was morning. The carolers were gone, but their melody lingered in my mind, looping endlessly, and every Christmas Eve since, they returned to sing. The tree stood proudly in the corner of our living room, its branches heavy with ornaments and strings of twinkling lights. Every year, it was the same routine. My parents and I would spend hours decorating it, arguing over where each piece should go. But this year, something felt different. As we finished hanging the last ornament, I noticed a faint red glow coming from deep within the branches. At first, I thought it was a reflection from the lights, but the glow didn't flicker or move. It pulsed, steady and slow, like a heartbeat. "Do you see that?" I asked, stepping closer. My mom frowned. "See what?" "The red light, right there." I pointed, but she just shook her head, turning back to the kitchen. I leaned in, brushing aside the branches. The glow grew brighter, revealing a small crimson orb nestled deep within the tree. It wasn't an ornament we'd put there. Its surface was smooth, almost glass-like, but it felt warm to the touch. As I stared at it, I could have sworn I heard something faint, a distant hum, low and rhythmic, coming from the orb. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, the glow intensified, casting eerie shadows across the room, and the hum? It turned into a whisper. The whisper grew louder as I sat in the dark, its voice threading through the stillness of the room. I couldn't make out words, just a constant murmur, like a secret being told just out of earshot. The glow from the orb painted the walls in shades of crimson. The ornaments on the tree, which once sparkled with holiday cheer, now cast long twisted shadows. Each seemed to warp under the light, their once familiar shapes becoming distorted. I stepped closer, unable to resist. The whisper turned sharp, clearer now. "Look," it urged. My eyes fell on one ornament in particular, a glass angel, its wings once pristine. Now cracked spider webbed across its surface, and its delicate face had twisted into a grotesque sneer. "What?" I muttered, reaching for it. The moment my fingers brushed the glass, a flash of images flooded my mind. Visions of past Christmases, but not mine. I saw faces of strangers, each scene darker than the last. families arguing, tears streaming down children's faces, and finally a figure standing by a tree, their hands stained red. I stumbled back, my head spinning. The whisper returned, colder now. You see, it said, a cruel edge to its tone. You all have secrets, and they all belong here. One by one, the other ornaments began to change, their reflections showing moments of shame, guilt, and pain. It wasn't just the tree that was watching, it was judging. The tree seemed to breathe, its branches shifting subtly as the ornaments continued to twist and crack. The whispers became a chorus, overlapping voices that filled the room with a dreadful harmony. I tried to back away, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The crimson orb pulsed brighter, illuminating something beneath the tree. The skirt we'd placed around its base had been pushed aside, revealing thick, black roots that snaked out from the trunk. They writhed slowly, like they were alive, and beneath them the floorboards had begun to rot. The scent of damp earth and decay filled the air. Why is this happening? I whispered, my voice trembling. The chorus of whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a single voice, deep, commanding. Because you brought it here. I froze. The orb's glow intensified, and the roots began to spread, creeping toward me. Desperation surged through me as I reached for the tree, trying to yank it from the floor. But the moment my hands touched the trunk, I felt that the tree wasn't just alive. It was hungry. Images flashed in my mind once more, but this time they were of my own life. Every mistake, every regret, every buried secret laid bare. The tree fed on them, growing stronger with each passing second. The roots coiled around my legs, pulling me closer. It's too late, the voice said. You've already given it what it wants. With a final, desperate scream, I tried to break free, but the last thing I saw was the crimson glow swallowing the room. It was the night before Christmas, and the snow fell in heavy drifts, muffling the world outside. Our house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of old floorboards and the soft ticking of the clock. I should have been asleep, but something didn't feel right. The air was heavy, and every shadow in my room seemed to stretch farther than it should. Then I heard it, a low thud, followed by the sound of something or someone dragging across the roof. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It wasn't the usual sound of sleigh bells or reindeer hooves. It was heavier, deliberate. Another thud, this time louder, coming from the living room below. I crept out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the Christmas tree downstairs. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw him. A man dressed in a tattered red suit stood by the fireplace, his back turned to me. He was tall, his frame unnaturally thin, and his long, bony fingers clutched a massive burlap sack. The sack writhed as if something inside was struggling to get out. I should have run, I should have screamed, but I couldn't move. The man turned slowly, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. When he spoke, his voice was low, guttural, and cold as the winter night. You've been naughty. His words echoed in the stillness, each syllable sinking deep into my chest. I wanted to speak, to explain that I didn't know what he meant, but my throat felt like it was frozen shut. The man, or whatever he was, took a step toward me, dragging the sack across the floor. The writhing inside grew more frantic, accompanied by faint, muffled cries. Please, I finally managed to whisper. I don't know what I did. He stopped, tilting his head as if considering my plea. Then, with a sudden, jerking motion, he threw the sack onto the floor. It split open, and out tumbled objects that made my blood run cold. A broken toy train, a torn book, a shattered picture frame. They weren't just random items, they were mine. Each one tied to a memory I'd tried to forget. The train I'd smashed in anger when I was younger. The book I'd destroyed out of spite. The picture frame I'd shattered. During an argument, the man crouched, picking up the toy train with his skeletal fingers. He held it out to me, his shadowed face tilting again. Every sin, he said, his voice almost a growl, leaves a mark. I stepped back, shaking my head. I didn't mean to. Intentions don't matter, he interrupted, his tone colder now. Only actions. Behind him, the Christmas tree began to flicker, its lights dimming one by one. The room grew darker, and the air seemed to vibrate with an unseen force. "You can't escape your list," he said, "and now you'll pay the price." The man stood, towering over me as the room plunged into near darkness. Only the faint, dying glow of the Christmas tree lit his face, and for the first time I saw his eyes, black hollow pits that seemed to pull the light and warmth from the air. "You were warned," he said, his voice a cold rumble, "but you didn't listen." The objects from the sack began to tremble on the floor, vibrating as if charged with energy. One by one, they lifted into the air, circling around me. The train, the book, the shattered frame, all spinning faster and faster. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Please, I'll make it right. I'll fix everything." His skeletal hand rose, and the objects stopped mid-air. For a moment there was silence. Then, with a flick of his wrist, they shattered, filling the room with an explosion of sound and light. I fell to my knees, shielding my face, but when I looked up, the man was gone. The house was quiet again, the Christmas tree flickering weakly, but something had changed. The sack remained, now limp and empty, save for one item inside. I crawled toward it, my hands trembling, and pulled out a piece of parchment, its edges singed. My name was written at the top, bold and red, with a list of every misdeed I'd ever committed below it. At the bottom, in large scrawled letters, was a single word: condemned. From outside I heard the sound of sleigh bells, low and mournful, and in the distance a deep echoing laugh. Every year since, the list grows longer. And every Christmas Eve I hear the bells. I know he'll return.